Hi, it's Tuesday, September 23rd, Monday the 22nd in the Atlantic, and we have three systems to discuss today. The first one, of course, is Super Typhoon Ragasa, now in the South China Sea. The system is now past the Philippines and will be tracking right up to South China as we head into our day on Wednesday, and we'll likely see a landfall there around that time frame as a strong typhoon. Behind it, we've got Invest 92W sitting in the tropical Pacific here. This system is likely to form over the next few days, and it's going to be tracking west towards the Philippines and will impact the region later this week. Not expected to be a strong storm here, but we may have to also watch it long term after it goes through the Philippines, as it might do something in the South China Sea. But we'll talk about that in greater detail in just a moment. And the last system is Hurricane Gabrielle in the central Atlantic. This system has really rapidly intensified over the past day, now to a Category 4 hurricane. And we'll talk about all the recon data we have with the system and the potential risk that the system could have to the Azores later this week once we get through all the Western Pacific stuff. We are starting in the Western Pacific again today with Super Typhoon Ragasa. The system has now entered the South China Sea today after impacting directly the Babuyan Islands here north of the Philippines. And we saw some pretty impressive pictures and videos out of those islands as the eye came through. Very, very strong winds, as you would expect, as the system was a Category 5 equivalent if you're going off of Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale categories. And we saw also pictures within the eye showing the classic stadium effect that is typical of super typhoons at that intensity. Now, the good news is today the core is now long gone from those islands, and there may be still some bands of thunderstorms you can see, like here, that impact the islands throughout the day today, but overall conditions will generally improve as the storm as a whole continues to move further west. So recovery efforts in the northern Philippines and the Babuyan Islands can start today, and hopefully, we don't have too much damage, but I'd say that's pretty unlikely just given the intensity the storm likely was going through there, and hope everyone is safe after the storm now. But going forward, we're now into the segment of the forecast where we're talking all about the landfall in southern China. This system has gradually come off of its peak, like we talked about it would since yesterday, and there may be a couple factors that caused that. One may be some northerly shear impacting the system right now. If I pause this at the end, you can kind of get the sense of some shear impacting the system out of the north. The south side with these deep cloud tops is a little bit more fat. It's a lot more fat, actually, than the north side. And the convection on this northern side has at times struggled to maintain itself north of the storm. And we have seen in some microwave data from overnight that the northern and northwestern eyewall has actually struggled a little bit to remain closed, possibly because of the shear vector. Now, there may have also been an eyewall replacement cycle going on. We saw some thunderstorm bands getting pretty close to the system's inner core when it was sitting over the northern Philippines. But the microwave that I just mentioned when it was over here showed that it really did not seem like we had a concentric band killing off this current inner eye, though we have seen this eye become more ragged and shrink a little. So that is a little unclear onto exactly what's happening here. What could have happened is we had initiated an eyewall replacement cycle, but the shear keeping convection from wrapping around has actually disrupted it. And sometimes with shear like this, it can completely stop the replacement cycle from happening. Now, importantly, this has not been a rapid weakening pace. This is still a super typhoon this morning over the South China Sea. And we are forecast to have the shear persist throughout, say, the next day, but as we get towards the coast of China, the shear begins to decrease, and we may see then a sort of plateauing, if that's the right word, or a leveling off is the better way to describe it, of the weakening. So we may not see it weaken all too much from even here up to the landfall in China. This is a shear diagnostic from the European. This is out to this morning, and you can see that northerly shear impacting the system right now in the mid to upper levels of the atmosphere. And it's about 15 to 20 knots right now, and this is consistent with what the GFS is also showing. And this would make sense because this does seem to be having an impact on the vortex of the typhoon. But as we go in time into tomorrow, we see the shear really back off. It goes down less than 10 knots, a little less than models were expecting, say, a couple of days ago. And so now this leaves a lower shear environment. And you also see that we kind of have the outline here of a trough digging in over central China. And between this trough and a ridge that's steering it off to the northeast, there's a little bit of a jet streak taking shape, and it's possible that that begins to favor a stronger poleward outflow channel, and that alongside the decreased shear may allow the system to maintain intensity. Now, in terms of re-intensification, I don't know that we'll see too much because, as I mentioned yesterday, the ocean heat content, so the depth of oceanic warmth, it gets lower here as you go towards the coast. And with all the strong winds that we have, because this is a very large typhoon, as you can see here with the wind field in the Picasa forecast, all the strong wind in advance of the eye is going to be working to cool off the water here off the south coast of China. And so that may mean that once the eye actually gets here, the waters are fairly cooled off to a point where it can't really intensify all too much. But it could still be suitable for the system to maintain intensity as a strong typhoon. So the expectation is still that this system is pretty strong by the time it gets to the south coast of China. And the other issue here is that the system is large, as I just mentioned. You can see this very large wind field. And the problem with this kind of a track, even though we're not making landfall in this forecast in Hong Kong, is that even though the system is going south, we have on the eastern side of it, say the center is here, all this wind on the back side pushing water from the South China Sea up towards the coast. And with this kind of a ragged coastline, there's so many areas where the water can be funneled into, especially bay areas here, like in Hong Kong, and that can really help to work and funnel that water right into those bay areas, causing very significant storm surge flooding all along the southern coast. So even though we may not see a direct landfall here in areas like Hong Kong, the impacts are still likely going to be significant. Alongside that, this core is still pretty decent size. We have seen the eye contract a little bit, which may go in our favor. That may shrink the radius of maximum winds. But if, say, we see a replacement cycle happen and it does enlarge, that can mean we have a very large eye wall. That means that even if it's further south here, the strong winds are still coming into the city. And so this is still a very significant storm, and preparations should be underway and be completed today in Hong Kong and really along the southern coast. As you can see, the wind field is getting already rather close to the coast, and later today, conditions will begin to deteriorate to a point where it will become too dangerous to prepare for the storm along this entire southern coast. So stay safe in the Philippines as the conditions continue to improve as the system leaves the region, and stay safe in China as the system continues tracking west closer to the landmass. I'll have another video on the system tomorrow, but we've got a couple other systems that we need to discuss today. First, we're going to go to Invest 92W behind Ragasa. This is a system sitting in the tropical Pacific, and we mentioned this a couple of days ago that it could form over the coming days. And now models have come into more of a unanimous agreement that the system will likely be forming over the coming days. And you can see already that the environment is getting a little bit more favorable for the system. Yesterday, we had a lot of northerly shear impacting the system from Typhoon Ragasa, but you could see the wall of northerly shear is backing west as the typhoon makes more progress towards the west. And so this is now making for a more favorable environment, especially because we have this little upper low that is backing towards the northwest, or the west-northwest rather, and this is likely fostering some of the convection over 92W today. And so models are in agreement that this will likely help kick the system into being a tropical cyclone. And we can see this happen if we look at the GFS 200 millibar flow. Let me go back to the beginning here. You can see, again, here's that wall of northerly shear on the backside of Ragasa. It's backing west, and here is Invest 92W. And so here's this upper trough here, and we have this zone of accelerating flow, a little bit of stronger flow in the upper levels of the atmosphere. And so what this does is it promotes divergence aloft, which is air spreading away at the top of the troposphere, and promotes thunderstorm formation where that acceleration occurs, and which is right in this case where 92W is. So we see the red number there go below 1,000 millibars down to the mid 990s, and we see the system actually form into a fairly significant tropical storm on the model into the Philippine Sea. And for now, this does look like a pretty favorable environment, as there's not very strong shear cutting across it, and we do have some pretty good divergence off to the southwest with all of this monsoonal flow further west. But the good news is here for the Philippines is that behind this upper low, as it tracks towards the west-northwest, we see a reinforcement in the northeasterly flow across the Philippine Sea with this ridge over Japan and the East China Sea. And you'll see that happen on the model. This upper low backs into Taiwan and China. And by this point, here's that northeasterly shear now increasing across the Philippine Sea. And this nets into a pretty significant um, vertical shear over the system, where the storm is going this way, the shear is this way, and this is also some pretty strong flow. So that nets pretty strong shear, and you'll see the red number here begins to rise, indicating weakening taking place because of that. Alongside that, we'll also see some weakening take place in all likelihood because of the land interaction here. And so all this comes together to really show that we're not expecting a strong typhoon here for now in the Philippines. And I don't really see a scenario where we get a strong typhoon out of this. This doesn't really have a lot of time to do that, and the shear is going to be pretty significant. And this is not just a GFS showing it. You can see the European model does show that as well, pretty significant shear out of the northeast. Now, beyond this, we may have to watch it going into the South China Sea as the environment may get a little bit better. You can see as we go in time into the GFS run, as we head into the South China Sea, all this northeasterly flow backs off from this ridge further north. And so we're now left with a fairly light flow aloft, and it's tapping again into all that divergence with the monsoonal flow further southwest, and the pressure begins to lower again on the model. Now, the GFS is being pretty aggressive here. I think it is being a little bit too aggressive. The European is a lot more mundane, but the European also does take a little bit of a different track than the GFS. You can see the GFS goes right through the central Philippines, and this would not, in all likelihood, impact the system as much as if it came further north. What we see on the European is the system comes more into Luzon, so it interacts with all this high terrain, and that leaves the system pretty disheveled going into the South China Sea, and so it never really gets attacked together. Alongside that, it's further north and closer to this upper low, so there may be some shear there that's also inhibiting some development from that. But it's still something to watch as we go in time. Usually with these systems, you see a bit of a middle ground between these two models. So we may see the system try to re-intensify some in the South China Sea. And we need to watch this in southern China and northern Vietnam, as the system will likely be coming west-northwest once it gets into the South China Sea. You can see that on the model there, though I wouldn't take this intensity with too much confidence here, as this is a long-range forecast about a week out, and it's a GFS, which tend to go pretty strong with these systems. So we'll watch Invest 92W over the next few days, but again, in short term, we're not expecting a very strong storm out of this because of shear, and we're just really expecting a tropical storm to come through here in the Philippines later this week. It may bring some rainfall to some of these areas in the central and northern Philippines. Okay, that's the Western Pacific side of things done. We're now going to move to the Atlantic with a pretty impressive view across the basin today. Much of a difference to what we've had really all month long, when it's been the peak season. This is Hurricane Gabrielle, which yesterday when I made my video was a minimal hurricane at 75 miles per hour, and now the system is estimated to have winds of 140 miles per hour, and that's estimated from recon data. We've had a lot of direct observations in the storm today, which has provided a pretty good sign into how this system has been intensifying over the past day today. And it's really been fascinating to watch. We did have at one point what seemed like an hour replacement cycle taking place, but recon data and radar data out of Bermuda helped see that we had something called a merger eyewall replacement cycle. And that's kind of where the inner eyewall and the secondary eyewall that forms kind of just merge together. And in those kinds of scenarios, those can often lead to the storm not weakening in the replacement cycle, but it can continue deepening through that. And we saw that in the recon data. You can see from the pass that they've done, or the 3 passes that they've done from this recon plane, we had a 12 millibar drop from the beginning of the mission to the end, and we saw winds generally increase as this pressure fell, with the latest observation on the eastern side supporting a surface wind of 130 to 140 miles per hour. And it's possible we are seeing some further intensification. I think we are nearing the peak of this hurricane, because if I go to the water vapor imagery, you can see it's getting rather close to all of the southwesterly flow, and there has been some indications on the western side that the shear is beginning to put some pressure upon the storm. It's not likely impacting the eye of the storm directly right now and inhibiting intensification. We may still be seeing it intensify, but eventually this pressure is going to become too much, and the system is going to start to succumb to the shear. And so we're probably near peak intensity now, but very impressive. From what we started with on this system, a very sheared, sloppy tropical storm, to one of the more picturesque hurricanes of the Northern Hemisphere cyclone season so far. Now, for Bermuda, we're really getting away with no impacts with this system. You can see we might have, a shower or two making it all the way over here, but for the most part, especially thanks to all the southwesterly flow, the strongest storms are onto the eastern side. And we can sort of see that kind of a profile here on the Raycon data. You can see all the strongest winds are really on the eastern side. There are some strong winds on the west side, but it's really much more kept to this west side, like I explained it would be a few days ago with that kind of a shear vector. Now, unfortunately, we do have an increased risk to the Azores going forward with this system as we head into the latter half of this week. If we look at the steering pattern for the system aloft, again, you can see all the southwesterly flow aloft, and there's an area of high pressure across the subtropical Atlantic. And simply what this storm's doing is rounding this ridge. So you'll see that it makes a pretty sharp turn, rounding the ridge by this point. And there is some pretty strong shear here. If we take a sounding over the system, you can see it's about 15 to 20 knots, but this is not as great as you would expect for a system getting pretty close to the subtropical jet right here. Because if you look, we have strong winds, but they're pretty much uniform throughout most of the troposphere. And you can really see that in the profile going throughout the entire troposphere. And so that's not too much shear impacting the system over the next few days. So we really don't see on the model the system weakening all too much. Alongside that, there might be some kind of a jet dynamic play going on further north with all the strong flow further north. And these will combine together to keep the system still likely a hurricane as it approaches the Azores. Now, it will be likely turning into an extratropical cyclone by that point, but the problem with that is that it begins to expand its wind field size. So we may see more expansive winds across the islands as it comes through. And you can see this updated forecast from the Hurricane Center now having it a hurricane by Thursday afternoon as it approaches the Azores. Now, the good news, like I mentioned yesterday with this, is that storms in this part of the Atlantic are typically going pretty fast when they come through the Azores. So we're not expecting a long duration event. But again, with it becoming an extratropical cyclone, it could still be, impacting all the islands because of the expanding wind field. And alongside that, it could still be a powerful extratropical cyclone. It could still be of hurricane force by the time it's coming through here, especially with this kind of jet dynamic interplay going on here between the tropical cyclone and the trough further north. Now, talking about wind field probabilities, this is the probabilities across the Azores, and you can see they have increased markedly since yesterday, now above 50%, especially for the western part of the island chain. And this is the earliest reasonable arrival time of those tropical storm force winds. You can see it by about Thursday morning, though it's more likely to be by Thursday evening. So generally, if you're going to make preparations for the storm, have them done by Wednesday evening or Thursday morning. That seems to be pretty good. As beyond that point, conditions will begin to deteriorate. But again, the good news is that the system will be tracking pretty fast, and you see that by Friday, it's now clearing out of the area as it tracks closer to Europe. And that will be the end of Hurricane Gabrielle. But behind Gabrielle, we'll have to watch a couple other systems. We have a couple tropical waves that we're monitoring that have actually pretty decent chances for developing over the next few days. And we're not going to talk too much detail on these, just kind of a overview of these two systems. The leading tropical wave has a 50-50 shot of developing in the next 7 days. For now, the environment is still pretty unfavorable for the system in the short term, so we're not expecting rapid development out of this, and we're really not expecting too many impacts from this as it comes through the Leeward Islands. But as it tracks to the Western Atlantic, the environment does get a little bit better, suited for development, and models have begun to show that the system could form here very close to the Bahamas or Turks and Caicos as we head throughout the latter half of this week and into this weekend. And we'll see what happens beyond this point. This is close to the Bahamas, so we may see some impacts there. And models have tried to show the system getting rather close to the U.S. East Coast, so we'll have to watch this over the next few days. And following that, we've got another tropical wave in the central tropical Atlantic. The system is likely to form over the next few days and will likely be staying further east into the central Atlantic. And we may have to watch this in Bermuda behind Gabrielle, as models are also uptaking on the potential for this system to form, and it may recurve in a way that would threaten Bermuda. But we'll have to see exactly what happens here as it's a long way out from when that system would be impacting Bermuda. But certainly getting into a little bit more of an active period here in the Atlantic. Seems like our peak season activity, so to say, is arriving here. So we'll have a lot to watch over the next week. That's all that I've got for today on all of these systems. Stay safe in the Philippines again as Ragasa's impacts continue to decrease throughout the day today, and stay safe in China as continue to deteriorate today as the system approaches. But I'll have more videos on all of these systems throughout this week. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.